Hi everyone, this video is a summary of the advice I give to my own students about writing essays and the guidance I give in the 17 hours of Patreon exam question videos. I really recommend hearing me out on all of these points, and if you find it useful, perhaps ask your teacher to show this in class. You or your teacher might actually disagree with me on certain points. That's fine. They might actually be right, and any conversation you have around these points, even if you disagree with me, would be useful. You can now follow along by making your notes in my PsychBoost workbook. 150 full-colour worksheets covering all the compulsory units. It's on Amazon, or you can get signed editions from my website. And teachers can order packs for the whole class. So my first bit of advice is timing. I made the lo-fi video to help you pace yourself when essay writing. The reason I made that was because in class tests, I often see poorly answered essays. And students tell me, "I'm sorry sir, I just ran out of time." Now, I know often students didn't actually revise, and they say they ran out of time just as an excuse. But timing is often a challenge in exams, especially when it comes to essays. Students will often overwrite the AO1 knowledge and not leave enough time for the AO3 evaluations. Not great when the split is 6 marks AO1 and 10 marks AO3. Even worse, where an exam paper has 3 essays and you spend so long on the first 2, you didn't even have time to start the third. So how long should you spend writing an essay, and why? In the exams, there are 96 marks, and unless you have extra time, you get 2 hours or 120 minutes to answer your questions. So with a bit of basic maths, you should be spending 20 minutes on a 16-marker question. Within that 20 minutes, based on the marks available, 7.5 minutes should be for your AO1, and 12.5 minutes should be for evaluation. However, from experience, I've found that having a little extra time for AO1 is useful, perhaps because students write a little slow at the start when thinking up their responses. So in real exams and class tests, when you see an essay, look at the clock and move on in 20 minutes. If you finish the exam early, you can always come back and add to an essay. Based on these numbers, I've developed a technique that I've used for the last few years. I get my students to write at exam pace using timers. 8 minutes for the AO1, and I'm going to break down the evaluation timer into 5, 4, and 3. We'll talk a little more about how many evaluations you should use later in this video. You should practice writing the time without notes, both in class and at home. A note for teachers, this is a really good classroom activity. One of the reasons I made the lo-fi video is I'm going to be using it in my class. Probably the version at the end without music and just beeps, as for some reason not everyone likes lo-fi. So teachers, set an essay that students have been warned to prepare for, so they can write it without notes. Then use the video as a strict timer on the board, and make sure students move on at the right time. While they're writing, I would advise going around the room with a highlighter, reading the essays as they're being written. That way you can identify mistakes as they happen, highlight the text and note down or quietly suggest improvements. I think this live feedback is more helpful for students than having to wait for feedback after you've marked a class set, because by the time they get that feedback, it will have been a few days, and they might not even remember why they wrote what they did. Run the full timer, and the students who don't get extra time can correct their mistakes in a different coloured pen while they wait for the extra timers to finish. I wouldn't recommend marking these essays. If you've identified one issue each student should work on, as well as helping them practice timing, I think the activity has been valuable. Hopefully use this technique a few times, and that old excuse for class tests, "Sorry sir, I ran out of time," won't be used again. The next thing I want to talk to you about is paragraphs. Every year I get first year students who don't use paragraphs, and it stresses me out. Marking a paper is hard, and you want to make it as easy as possible for whoever's grading your paper. They need to process what you've written, and importantly, credit you for what you've written. Hopefully you know working memory is limited, so don't overwhelm your reader. Break down your text into paragraphs, because if you're making the marker read long chunks of text, they might forget some of the details you've included. So the AO1 should be in at least 2 paragraphs, and give each evaluation its own paragraph. And another point, use a line space between each paragraph, or it won't look like you're using them at all. Handwriting. On a similar point, make sure you have clear handwriting. If the marker's having to pause and spend mental effort trying to make out individual words, they're going to struggle to fully remember the points and the flow of the argument you're making. Also, it's annoying to mark bad handwriting. Now, me being annoyed shouldn't affect your grade, as consciously, I do want to give you the grade you deserve. But unconsciously? Who knows? Bad handwriting includes a messy scrawl, but also that super neat handwriting where every letter is the same height. We use the height differences between letters when we read to make out words quickly. If you think that you might have messy handwriting, give it to a friend and ask them to read out what you've written as fast as they can. If they struggle to read it quickly and keep stopping, then you have a problem and either need to practice writing more neatly, because it is a skill, or if all else fails, ask to use a computer to type your responses. How much should I write? This is a simple one. It depends on you. I've seen students who seem to write like printers, producing page after page. Some students are a lot slower. I'm a pretty slow writer. But as the exam is timed, you have to work within your own abilities. How are you going to find your limits? I would pick the essay you would most like to write in an exam, something you know back to front. Prepare for it the best you can and write it in that strict 20-minute time limit. And the reason I'm getting you to write your favourite essay is I don't want you to stop writing and to think about the next point. Hopefully when the exam comes around, after all of that revision, you should know all of the content to a similar level. The number of words you produce when writing that essay should be at the top end of how much you should expect from yourself. If you find you can't write a large quantity of words in the time available, you need to make sure that what you do write is of high quality. Hopefully the rest of this video will be able to help you out with that, including key terminology. The core of good AO1 tends to be knowing and showing you understand the key terminology that's linked to the topic you're writing about. Now, memorizing and then loading all those terms with a shotgun and just blasting them into the essay and hoping the marker is going to make sense of them is not a good strategy for grades. You want to show me that you actually know what these terms mean. So if you write some key terminology, make sure you either immediately give a brief definition or at least use it in the correct context to show that you know what it means. When it comes to judging understanding, often what I find is weaker students have memorized the definition with fancy words, but when they try to write it out, it all comes out in a bit of a mess. That's a pretty big red flag that the student doesn't understand the concept or the other words that they've used. It would be better to make sure before the exam you can explain and write about an idea in words that you can actually understand. Using more complex vocabulary is great, but only when you're sure you're using it correctly. A great revision technique for this is sitting with a whiteboard and another psychology student and each taking it in turns to write a term and then reteaching it without notes. If the other student thinks that you've got it wrong or just seems confused, it's best to go back to your notes or my videos and check you understand the term. So for most AO1 sections, give me a key term, define it briefly, don't waffle, perhaps give me a short example and then move on to the next term. Rinse and repeat as much as possible in the time available and you should do well. Another point that's kind of linked is I often find students use the word it excessively. This can be a problem as sometimes it's not clear which term you've used that the it is referring to. Now, a few its are okay, but too many makes your work sound really imprecise. Instead of it, elevate your writing style by repeating the key term or idea you're actually referring to. Depth versus breadth. When marking essays, you consider breadth, how many concepts a student has covered, and depth, how much detail they've given about each concept. Students can only do so much under exam conditions. Some will have more depth, while some will have more breadth. Both are ways to get marks, but you should aim to have a balance. Saying too much about one point can end up sounding repetitive, and the details can get less relevant. But giving too many points, like a bullet point list, makes you question if the student actually knows the details of what they've written. Generally, when it comes to AO1, giving a key term, some definition to show that you know what it is, then giving a brief example is more than enough. So 2 or 3 sentences on an idea and then move on to another concept. Essay structure. Generally, you want all of your AO1 first and then your AO3. However, that's not a hard and fast rule. You could use this structure for outline and evaluate 2 definitions of abnormality or discuss explanations for attachment, describing both and then comparing them in the evaluations. But really, you're likely to get lost doing this. You're best explaining one, evaluating it, and then explaining the other, and then evaluating that one. Perhaps with your final evaluation suggesting if the point suggests that your second explanation is better or worse than the first explanation. If there's an application question, get the application integrated with the AO1 from the start. Don't be tempted to write your AO1 points and then effectively rewrite it again, linking to the scenario. And don't be afraid of using application again in the evaluations. Let's go a little deeper on application essays. I'm a big fan of application questions. I think they reward students who really understand psychology over those who've just memorized facts. And ultimately, as a psychology teacher, students understanding my subject is what I want. So, how do application questions work? Well, you get a scenario. This is often called a stem. And within that stem, there'll be parts of it that link to different parts of the topic that you need to write about. Your job is to integrate that scenario into your essay. This tends to require a little creativity, which stresses out those just tell me what to write students. The number of potential application questions is infinite, so there is no way for your teacher to prepare you for all of them. You have to think on your feet. But what is helpful about an application question is a scenario can remind you of the key parts of a theory. For this example, I'm assuming you've studied social influence. If not, hopefully you can still follow along. I want you to underline the parts of the scenario that link to the question, and then I want you to write out the key terms that you'll be using in the essay around the stem. Then draw a line from the text to the key term. Here are the key terms that I want to use. Pause again if you missed any, and try to link the correct sections of the text. Okay, here are the sections of the text that I want to link each term to. This should be your first task before starting an application question. Now we're going to write out our responses. The most important thing is to explicitly apply the scenario while writing the text. Just saying he is showing a key term is not enough. Exactly what's happening in the scenario that demonstrates the key term in action. The marker needs to be completely sure that you've made the correct connection. So even if it seems obvious, make the connection clear in your text. Perhaps by using the phrase, in this case. I'll show you my version, but perhaps you want to have a go yourself. Don't write the evaluations. I tend to find 12 minutes is about right for the AO1 and AO2 of these essays. Okay, hopefully you can see I've not overwritten any individual point. I've shown I know the key term. I've shown I know what the key term means, either by directly defining it or using it in the correct context. I've applied it not by using basic he, she, but by taking the behavior directly out of the text or adding in something that makes sense in the context of the scenario. Number of evaluations. There is no question I get asked more in class and online than how many evaluations do I need to remember and use in an essay? What do you think the answer is? Well, unfortunately, there isn't a simple answer. I do actually have a good and maybe surprising answer, but it's going to require an explanation. Firstly, you need to think, what is it that I want to get out of this course? For most of you, I imagine you have dreams of getting an A star, and it is good to be aspirational. So what do you need to get that? Well, discounting the pandemic years, it was around 75% of the marks available. So average across all questions, that's actually only 12 out of 16 on an extended essay. That likely sounds shockingly low to many of you, as I bet most of you can get 12 out of 16 in a class test. However, in reality, getting 75% consistently in the real exam is hard, as shown by the fact that only about 5% of students manage to do it and get the A star. So why am I telling you this? Well, for many reasons, getting 15 out of 16 or 16 out of 16 in an exam is very rare. But getting to 12 is quite achievable. Let's, for argument's sake, assume each evaluation is worth 2 points. So you need 5 evaluation points to get to 16. But 3 good evaluation points would be fine for a 12 marker. That's not really true. You should be able to get to 16 with 3 fantastic evaluations. But for argument's sake, let's just go with it. If you only went for 12 marks, how many points would you lose in an exam year with that assumption? Let's do this for the previous 6 exam years. And keep in mind, across all the papers, there are 288 points available. Well, in 2024, there were 6 essays, but 3 were application essays. So for those, there were only 6 AO3 marks available anyway. In each of the years I looked at, there were 6 essays across the 3 papers, of which between 1 and 3 of those essays were application. So for each year, the essays are worth 96 marks, so a third of your grade. But 36 marks for those essays are for the AO1. So using our assumptions, let's say we focus on 3 evaluations and smash them. We get 6 out of the 10 evaluation marks, or on the application essay, all 6 available. How many points are we giving up on? Well, in 2024, that would be 12 marks. In 2023, 12 marks. In 2022, 20 marks. 2021, 16 marks. 2020, 12 marks. 2019, 12 marks. In the grand scheme of things, when there are 288 marks to play for, that's not many really, is it? So, you have to ask yourself if memorizing an additional 2 evaluations for every single potential essay across the entire A-level is worth it to chase relatively few marks. That's a lot of revision time that could be spent making sure the evaluations and knowledge you do write are fully understood. Now, there is a slight point to make about 8 markers that focus on just part of the section, like the one on cognitive neuroscience a few years ago. But that won't make much of a difference to the overall point I'm trying to make. Now, how many evaluations do I teach in the classroom? 5. Now, you're likely thinking, what the hell, after all of that, he teaches 5 evaluations? Why? Well, just because I teach 5, it doesn't mean I expect the students to memorize all of them. Most of the evaluations I use in the classroom and my videos are generic evaluations. Unless there's a good reason, there'll only be 1 or maybe 2 evaluative studies that are unique to the topic. Now, the problem with generic evaluations is they're often not written with the context you need to score highly. So, if over 2 years I give example after example after example of generic evaluations with context, I hope that eventually students will understand the difference between a well-written generic evaluation and a poorly written one. And basically, they should have the skills to create a good generic evaluation up in the moment, and not even have to explicitly revise them. Do I expect students in the real exam to produce 5 well-developed evaluations? Wow, some of the fast writers can. And I want to give students the tools to do that if they want to. But for the vast majority of students, no. Even with the extra time I would get for my dyslexia, I would struggle. So for slow writers, if they try, the evaluations are likely to be rushed and underdeveloped. So 3 well-written evaluations that are fully developed and are clearly answering the question is a good target. I'm telling you all this to tell you not to panic. If revising a load of evaluations is messing with your mind, chill out. Drop down to 3 or even 2 and you'll do better. If for some reason you can easily remember and write loads of evaluations, knock yourself out and go for it. So how many evaluations do you need to remember? Well, that is up to you. You need to self-reflect and think about what you want to do and what you're capable of. But one thing's for sure, it's not worth getting stressed out over this number of points. And even if it was, just revising more and more evaluations is not actually the route to a better grade. 8 marker essays. Many of the points I've made apply to the 8 markers. There are no 12 markers in A-level psychology, they are AS questions only. The 12 markers can be used in your revision, but treat them as 16 markers. By the way, I know there could be 12-mark research methods questions, but they are very different. And I think they're best thought of not as an essay, but a collection of smaller questions. Now, the issue for many 8-marker essays is overwriting. Overwriting can be a problem with 16 markers, but for 8 markers, you've likely revised enough content to write a full 16 marker. But you have half the time to write it, so you have to decide on your priorities. Don't just dive in, reread the question. It might be asking you to focus on just one part of the topic. If it does, shape what you know to be clearly answering the point asked. If you can talk about any part of the topic you want, then focus on the parts that you know you can make clearly. The examiner won't be expected to see everything you know. For example, let's say the essay is an 8-marker outlining and evaluating social learning theory. Well, if you're comfortable with vicarious reinforcement, identification, imitation, and modelling, but not on mediational processes, focus on fully explaining the terms you do know, perhaps with 1 or 2 brief examples. After all, it's only 3 marks. Ask yourself, would you include Bandura's research in this question? Well, probably not. Even though in the spec it's part of the required knowledge, Bandura's research isn't social learning theory. It's a demonstration of it. And while in 3 marks of AO1, you could talk about vicarious reinforcement, identification, imitation, and modelling using Bandura's research as reference, most students are going to get totally lost wasting time given details about the method of the Bobo doll study that simply isn't credit-worthy. Perhaps save it for an evaluation. One positive of social learning theory is its concepts have been supported by Bandura's own research. And then go on. Number of evaluations. Based on our previous conversation, 2 is a pretty safe bet. But if you're using 1, 2, or even 3, keep the same level of detail in your evaluations as you would in a 16 marker. Don't be tempted to bullet point all the ones you know. I just mentioned overwriting, and it might seem silly to say don't write too much. Surely more is better. Well, not at the expense of all the other things that you could be talking about. Focusing on one idea too long can quickly turn into waffle. Let me give an example from my own classroom. I start by teaching approaches, and one of the first 16 marker essays I get my students to write is outline and evaluate the biological approach. Now in class, I teach them everything that's needed in the spec. I start with genes, including genotypes and phenotypes, and then onto biological structures, neurochemistry, and then evolution. I teach all of this in some detail, because as they're all named in the spec, AQA can ask you a question about any one of these topics. But all of this is too much detail for the 6A or 1 marks of an essay. What could go wrong in an essay knowing all of the content of a topic in detail? So in this first essay, what I tend to find is new students start with genes, genotypes and phenotypes, but then give me too much detail about twin studies, level of genetic and physical similarity and concordant rates, not really linking it to what the biological approach fundamentally is, using biology to explain behaviour. And they ultimately run out of time to give any real detail about biological structures like the brain, neurochemistry or evolution. I don't mind students making this mistake early on, as it is a learning experience. So rather than go into a deep dive just on genes, it would be better to summarise all of this into biological psychologists argue that behaviour is caused in part by individuals' genetic makeup. For example, candidate genes have been identified for mental health disorders like OCD and schizophrenia. Now there is more detail I could say, but I wanted to show in just a short sentence that I've made clear that I know the concept of genes are linked to biopsychology, the fact that genes have a causal relationship to behaviour, psychology after all is the study of behaviour, and I've given you an example of a behaviour that's linked to genetics. I could write a little bit more about genes, maybe a sentence about inheritance, or I can use a sentence about genes to move smoothly into the next concept. One way these genes are thought to influence behaviour is by altering brain chemistry, such as the activity of the neurotransmitter serotonin. And then I'm on to the next concept, but also showing I know a process by which genes cause behaviour change. A few sentences that say a lot are far more useful than pages of writing that don't really go anywhere. But don't worry, learning what to put in and, as importantly, what to leave out of an essay is a skill you'll develop with practice. Seeing examples of good work. I don't talk much about myself in these videos. Maybe I'll do a special video if I ever hit 100,000 subs, so yeah, maybe subscribe. But I'll tell you one story. I didn't do too well in my first years at uni. And in your final year, you write a dissertation, and it's worth a substantial proportion of your overall grade. Basically, to rescue my degree, I needed to smash that dissertation out of the park. So what I did was go to the university library, and they keep student dissertations for a few years that you can check out. I got out every first-class dissertation from the previous 3 years and analysed each one. Now, none of them had anything to do with the subject of my dissertation, but my idea was this. I wanted my work to look like a first-class dissertation from the moment the lecturer started reading it. So I looked at how the pages were laid out, how many graphs and charts were included, the type of language that was used, how many references were included on average, just loads and loads of small things. So I knew what a first-class dissertation looked like. I also got a few low-scoring dissertations to see the difference. I made a bullet point list of all the things I noticed and kept that on my wall, looking back at it as I was writing my own dissertation. I did do pretty well in that dissertation, so I guess the process worked. The reason I'm telling you that story is I want you to start thinking about what a top-end essay looks like and what you need to change in your essays so they look like that. For you to be able to do that, you need to be able to see top-end essays. Now, I do have essay videos on Patreon, but actually in my own classroom, I don't show my own writing. Because students can rightly say, well, you're a psychology teacher with almost 10 years experience. Of course you can write that. So what I actually do is this. Once I've marked a class test, I pick out one of the best essays from the students that have sat the exam. And then I speak to them in private saying how much I like their essay, and if they would be happy if I shared it with the other students in the year. And of course, I ask them if they want me to say if it's theirs or not. This does a few things. Firstly, I hope it shows that student that I really appreciate the work that's gone into preparing for the test. Secondly, I hope the other students feel like they want to work hard on future tests, so I pick their essays. And I do try to pick different students each time. But most importantly, I want every student to see what another student who's been in the same class with the same time limits has been able to write. So, if you want to see good quality work, what can you do? Well, you can ask your teacher if they can do the same as me. Or you can ask a classmate who consistently scores well to show you their essays. Or you can actually access some questions that have been marked by AQA on this link. But these resources tend to show a range of scores rather than just high-end responses. So that was my video on how to write good essays. I hope it was helpful. I do want to thank again my patrons, as it is honestly their support that allows me to work part-time so I can make free content like this for everyone. If you want to join them and get access to all my extra resources, follow the link.